And it did collapse. But instead of destroying me, it freed me. As dusk settled over the gathering, someone started playing guitar. Fireflies emerged, drawing delighted gasps from the children. Karen felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in decades. Her phone buzzed. An email from the county commissioners. The Wellington Thornhill initiative had been approved for expansion to 10 more neighborhoods, with funding for educational programs on sustainable suburban agriculture. Good news, Jacob asked, noting her expression. The best, she confirmed, showing him the message. But there's a catch. They want us to present together at the regional planning conference next month. Jacob grimaced. You know how I feel about public speaking. And you know how I feel about backing down from a challenge, Karen countered, the flash of her old determination appearing briefly. He laughed, recognizing the glimpse of the formidable woman who'd once been his nemesis. Some things don't change entirely, do they? Some things shouldn't, Karen agreed. Determination isn't bad when it's aimed at the right targets. As stars appeared overhead, conversations quieted, children dozed in parents' laps. In this peaceful moment, Karen thought about the fence that still stood between Jacob's farm and the subdivision, no longer a barrier, but a reminder of how far they'd all come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The developer who'd once been Karen's ally was now trying to rezone agricultural land on the other side of town. Former HOA members resistant to change were organizing opposition to the garden initiative. Jacob's son was considering selling his portion of the farm inheritance. But tonight, in this moment of community and connection, those battles could wait. Karen Wellington, once the most feared woman in Whispering Pines, now the most surprising ally of local agriculture, allowed herself to simply be present, neither controlling nor controlled. Jacob leaned over, voice low. You know what I think, Karen? I think sometimes it takes a force of nature to change the landscape. You were that storm. You just needed to blow in the right direction. Karen smiled, watching a firefly land briefly on her hand, before continuing its luminous journey. Well, she said, I've always had excellent parking skills. It just took me a while to find the right spot. The coffee was nothing like Karen's imported organic beans, just standard grocery store brand in a chipped mug, but it was the best thing she'd tasted in years. Jacob's kitchen was warm, lived in, with children's drawings magnetized to the refrigerator and a gentle golden retriever named Scout, who'd immediately rested his head on Karen's lap. I need to understand, she said finally, after they'd sat in surprisingly comfortable silence, why this farm matters so much. Help me see what I've been missing. Jacob considered her for a long moment, as if weighing her sincerity. Put on those boots by the door, he said finally. I want to show you something. In borrowed rubber boots and Jacob's late wife's jacket, Karen followed him into the night. The farm after dark was different. Peaceful, alive with cricket songs and distant owl calls. Jacob led her to a hill overlooking his property and the subdivision beyond. My grandfather called this perspective point, he said. Whenever we thought we had problems, he'd bring us here to look at the bigger picture. From this vantage, Whispering Pines looked small, just one development in a landscape that stretched toward the horizon. Karen could see her own house, lights blazing in empty rooms. I was born in Boston, you know, Jacob said quietly. My parents moved here when I was 4. Dad was a professor who decided farming was his calling. Everyone thought he was crazy. Karen looked at him in surprise. She'd assumed he was farm-born, uneducated, another assumption proven wrong. I have a master's degree in agricultural science, he continued, reading her expression. Chose to come back here after my wife got sick. Urban farming innovations have kept this place profitable. Each revelation dismantled Karen's carefully constructed narrative about Jacob and his farm. He wasn't an obstinate old man refusing progress. He was preserving something valuable while adapting to changing times. I've made a terrible mistake, Karen whispered. Several, Jacob agreed, but without malice. Question is, what are you going to do now? The next morning, Karen called a lawyer, not to fight, but to surrender. She signed over her position as HOA president. She authorized a generous settlement to Jacob for the property damage and harassment. She put her oversized house on the market. Richard was shocked when she agreed to all his divorce terms without negotiation. Her children were suspicious when she called to apologize for years of controlling behavior. Her former HOA allies were bewildered when she publicly admitted her vendetta against the farm had been misguided. "You're having a breakdown," her friend Susan insisted over lunch. "This isn't like you, Karen." "Maybe that's the point," Karen replied. "Maybe like me isn't someone I want to be anymore." The dissolution of her marriage was finalized quickly. The sale of her house took longer. The market for massive homes with restrictive HOAs was softening. Karen moved into a modest condo downtown, donated most of her designer clothes, and in the most shocking move of all, applied for a position with the County Agricultural Extension Office. When Jacob saw her name on the application, he laughed out loud. "You think I've lost my mind," Karen said when he called. "I think you're finding yourself," he corrected. "And I think your organizational skills could be useful to local farmers fighting corporate takeovers." It was the strangest alliance the county had ever seen. The former HOA tyrant and the stubborn farmer, working together to protect local agriculture. People whispered, of course. Some said Karen was manipulating Jacob for some future scheme. Others said Jacob was too forgiving for his own good. Neither of them cared much what people said anymore. "We've both spent too many years caring about the wrong things," Jacob told her one evening as they reviewed grant applications for small farm support. Karen nodded, understanding completely. "Turns out fences work both ways," she said. "They keep people out, but they also keep you in." The gleaming white Porsche Cayenne sat like an alien spacecraft amid the muddy field of Jacob Thornhill's farm, its tires already sinking slightly into the soft earth after last night's rain. Karen Wellington stood beside it, designer boots now ruined, screaming into her phone while gesturing wildly at the approaching tractor. Jacob wasn't driving slowly. "Stop right now. This is harassment," Karen shrieked, her perfectly highlighted blonde bob swinging as she stomped her foot. "I have every right to park here. It's a community easement." Jacob cut the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. The 60-year-old farmer, weathered face set in granite determination, climbed down from his John Deere with surprising agility. Behind him, attached to the tractor, was a massive metal fence panel, 12 feet high and 20 feet long, with bright red "No TOESPASLNG" signs already attached. "Morning, Karen," he said with exaggerated politeness. "I see you've parked on my alfalfa field." Again. Karen's face flushed crimson beneath her immaculate makeup. "For the last time, Thornhill. This is a public space according to the Whispering Pines HOA bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph. Ma'am, your HOA paperwork stops at my property line." Jacob gestured to a weathered stake 50 yards behind her. "You're a quarter mile onto my land. Now, you've got exactly 3 minutes to move your vehicle before I place this fence right behind it." "You wouldn't dare," Karen hissed, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Jacob checked his watch. 2 minutes, 50 seconds. Karen had been the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association for 6 years, ever since moving from Boston with her husband, Richard, a plastic surgeon who was rarely home. In that time, she'd issued 347 violation notices, forced 12 homeowners to repaint their houses to approved colors, and personally measured grass height with a ruler on Sundays. The subdivision butted up against Jacob's third-generation farm, a fact that had driven Karen to distraction from day one. The farm's roosters, the occasional smell of manure, the unsightly tractors, all of it offended her sense of suburban perfection. For 3 years, she tried to force him to sell through complaints, petitions, and even a failed lawsuit claiming his property devalued homes in Whispering Pines. 6 months ago, she'd started parking on the edge of his land during her inspections, claiming it was an easement. Jacob had left polite notes, then less polite notes, then called towing companies, who refused to come after Karen threatened their businesses with legal action. The county sheriff had come twice, but told them it was a civil matter. 1 minute, Jacob announced, climbing back into his tractor. Something in his voice made Karen pause. She'd never backed down from a confrontation in her life. It was how she clawed her way to regional sales director at her pharmaceutical company, how she'd secured her position in the HOA, and how she maintained control over her increasingly distant husband. But the calm certainty in the farmer's eyes unsettled her. "This is absurd. I'm calling my lawyer," she snapped, fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. Jacob started the tractor. Karen's lawyer didn't answer. Richard didn't answer. The HOA vice president suggested she might want to move her car. As the tractor began to move forward with the massive fence in tow, Karen made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of moving her car, she planted herself directly in Jacob's path. "I dare you," she screamed over the engine noise. "Run me over, and I'll own this farm by sunset." Jacob stopped the tractor 10 feet from her, cut the engine, and calmly pulled out his phone. "Hello 911, I'd like to report a trespasser who's threatening me on my private property." The county zoning board meeting was standing room only. Word had spread that Porsche Karen, the nickname now firmly established in local vernacular, was making her move against Thornhill Farm. The local newspaper had run a feature on Jacob, third-generation farmer, widower, Vietnam veteran, supplier to 3 food banks, complete with a photo of him holding a basket of fresh produce. Next to it, they'd run Karen's now infamous screenshot from the viral video, her face contorted in rage. Karen ignored the whispers as she walked to the podium. Dressed in a conservative navy suit, her presentation materials organized in a leather portfolio. She'd rehearsed this moment for days. The property line discrepancy, the outdated agricultural exemptions, the noise and environmental concerns. "Members of the board," she began, her voice steady despite the hostile room. "This isn't about personalities. This is about progress, property values, and proper land use for our growing community." For 40 minutes, she laid out her case with the precision of a prosecutor, producing documentation, precedents, and projections. This was Karen in her element, controlling the narrative, marshalling facts, pushing toward an inevitable conclusion. Several board members looked thoughtful, taking notes. When Jacob's turn came, he walked slowly to the podium. No leather portfolio, no PowerPoint, just a weathered man in clean overalls. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, his deep voice filling the room. "My family's worked that land for 87 years. My grandfather survived the Dust Bowl on that farm. My father expanded it during the farm crisis of the 80s. My late wife and I raised our kids there before cancer took her." He paused, looking directly at Karen. "Mrs. Wellington talks about progress. To me, progress isn't more subdivisions or higher property values. It's sustainable farming that feeds our community. It's preserving green space for our children's children." He pulled a creased paper from his pocket. "I've got 37 letters here from families who rely on my produce donations. I've got statements from the Historical Society about the farm's significance." The room erupted in applause when he finished. The board voted 4-1 to dismiss Karen's complaints. Outside, a crowd surrounded Jacob, offering support. No one approached Karen as she walked stiffly to her car, the weight of another public defeat pressing on her shoulders. That night, Richard didn't come home. Instead, a courier delivered divorce papers. Creative, irreconcilable differences. He'd moved in with his office manager, an affair Karen had suspected but been too busy to confirm. Alone in her immaculate house, Karen poured a glass of wine, then another. Her phone remained silent. No calls from her adult children, no messages from friends. When had she become so isolated? When had winning become more important than connection? The wine bottle empty, Karen drove to the edge of Jacob's property in the darkness. The fence he'd installed now ran the entire border between his farm and Whispering Pines, a physical manifestation of the barrier she'd created with her actions. Through a gap, she could see Jacob's farmhouse. Lights on, a simple dinner with his son's family, visible through the window. Laughter. Connection. Something broke inside Karen, releasing years of tightly controlled emotions. She slumped against her car, sobs racking her body. What had it all been for? The control, the rules, the constant battle to make everything perfect. When headlights swept across her, Karen didn't move, didn't try to hide her tears. Jacob's truck pulled up, and the farmer stepped out, regarding her cautiously. "You all right, Mrs. Wellington?" "No," Karen whispered, the most honest answer she'd given in years. "I'm really not." Jacob nodded slowly. "Would you like to come in for some coffee? It's getting cold out here." The unexpected kindness nearly undid her completely. "Why would you offer that, after everything I've done?" Jacob shrugged. Been farming long enough to know that sometimes the hardest ground eventually yields if you're patient enough. The video of Karen being escorted off Jacob's property by Sheriff Dawson went viral within hours. Someone had titled it "Porsche Karen Gets Fenced In," and by nightfall, it had 3 million views. Karen watched the footage for the 18th time, wincing as the camera caught her screeching about her rights, while the sheriff patiently explained that no, the farm was not subject to HOA regulations, and yes, she was trespassing. "They've made me look deranged," she whispered to her reflection in the marble bathroom of her 4,800-square-foot home. Her phone buzzed again, another notification. The Whispering Pines community Facebook page was in an uproar, with neighbors she'd cited for violations over the years gleefully sharing the video. Richard finally returned from his conference in Chicago, taking one look at Karen's tear-streaked face before pouring himself a generous scotch. "You need to let this go, Karen," he said, loosening his tie. "We can afford the impound fee for the Porsche." Jacob agreed to let the towing company in tomorrow. "Let it go?" Karen's voice rose dangerously. That dirt farmer humiliated me. Do you know what this will do to my authority in the HOA? To my reputation?" Richard sighed, the weariness of a 20-year marriage evident in his slumped shoulders. "Maybe it's time to step back from the HOA anyway. When was the last time you actually enjoyed anything?" The question hit Karen like a slap. When had she last enjoyed something? Before the HOA, she'd painted watercolors, she'd played tennis, she'd laughed more. "That's not the point," she snapped, pushing the uncomfortable thought away. "The point is that I will not be made a fool of. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night." The meeting was a disaster. Karen had envisioned solidarity, a united front against the eyesore farm. Instead, she faced open rebellion. Melissa from Oak Drive brought up how Karen had forced her to remove her daughter's memorial garden. Jeff from Pine Circle mentioned the $500 fine for having his work truck in his driveway overnight. Even her ally Susan looked uncomfortable. "I move that we vote on new HOA leadership," said Tom Wheeler, a retired judge who'd previously kept quiet during Karen's reign, "and that we formally apologize to Mr. Thornhill." The motion passed 23-1. Karen fled the clubhouse, humiliation burning in her chest. In her car, her second car, a Mercedes sedan, she sobbed until her mascara ran in black rivers down her cheeks. Then, something hardened inside her. This wasn't over. Jacob Thornhill hadn't won. He'd merely awakened something in Karen that had been dormant for years, that absolute refusal to lose. The next morning, she was at City Hall when it opened, poring over zoning regulations and property records with maniacal focus. By afternoon, she was meeting with a developer friend from her country club. By evening, she'd filed a complaint with the County Agricultural Board citing outdated regulations on farm equipment storage. And by the following day, she'd hired a private investigator to find anything questionable in Jacob's past. "Karen, this is insane," Richard said when he found her at 2 a.m., surrounded by papers in their home office. "You're talking about destroying a man's livelihood over a parking spot." "It's not about the parking," Karen said, her voice eerily calm. "It's about respect. It's about order. It's about who's in control." Richard stared at his wife, as if seeing her for the first time. "I don't recognize you anymore," he said quietly, before walking out. Karen barely registered his departure. She'd found something interesting. Jacob's property tax history showed an anomaly 15 years ago, a possible clerical error in the property line description. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in his armor. And Karen Wellington had built a career, a reputation, and a life on exploiting weaknesses. What she didn't know was that Jacob Thornhill had dealt with developers, corporations, and bureaucrats trying to push him off his land for decades. And unlike Karen, he didn't fight because of pride or control. He fought for home. 1 year to the day after the infamous Porsche incident, Karen stood in the middle of what had once been her immaculate lawn, now transformed into a thriving community garden. Neighborhood children darted between tomato plants, their hands and faces smeared with dirt. Parents chatted while harvesting string beans. On a wooden bench beneath an apple tree sat Jacob, demonstrating seed-saving techniques to an attentive audience. Karen watched it all with quiet satisfaction. The 5 garden plots behind former Whispering Pines houses were the pilot program for what was becoming known as the Wellington Thornhill Initiative, converting portions of suburban lawns into productive food gardens, with Jacob providing the agricultural expertise and Karen handling logistics, permits, and community organization. Mrs. Wellington called 8-year-old Emma, racing toward her with a misshapen carrot. "Look what I grew." Karen knelt to admire the vegetable, remembering a time when she would have issued a violation notice for the mere existence of a garden visible from the street. "That's wonderful, Emma. Perfect for tonight's soup." From the corner of her eye, Karen caught Jacob watching her, a small smile playing across his weathered face. He'd become her unlikely mentor in this new life, patient with her mistakes, generous with his knowledge, and occasionally still stunned by her transformation. Not that it had been easy. Karen's first months of change had been met with skepticism and outright hostility from those who'd suffered under her HOA regime. It had taken consistent effort, genuine apologies, and Jacob's vouching for her sincerity to slowly rebuild trust in the community. Her ex-husband Richard had perhaps been the most confused by her evolution. "You could have fought for half my practice in the divorce," he'd said during their last meeting, signing over the final paperwork. "The old Karen would have taken me for everything." The old Karen was miserable, she'd replied simply, and making everyone else miserable too. Now, as the community garden gathering transitioned into an impromptu potluck dinner on picnic tables where perfect lawns had once stretched, Karen found herself seated beside Jacob, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors no HOA-approved paint chip could capture. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, gesturing to the scene before them. Former enemies breaking bread together, children playing without concern for property lines. Jacob considered the question. "No," he admitted. "But that's the thing about farming. You plant seeds not knowing exactly what will grow, just trusting in the process." Karen nodded, understanding the metaphor. "I spent so many years trying to control everything, afraid that one crack in the perfect facade would bring everything crashing down." "And?" Jacob prompted.